carbon scatter units will match your Cinema 4D scenes and the settings that you have. If you're using R12 or higher, if you go to the document setting within the attribute editor, you're going to see document scale. I have mine set to 1 meter, or 1 meters, and this is how you change your units. If you're working with R11, this is going to show up within the units mode. So in R11 you can set, if you have it set to meters or centimeters, it will modify the units within carbon scatter for the functions and also the scale of the view plans, or sorry, the carbon scatter plans. If you may catch me saying view here and there throughout the training, just because the carbon scatter was created from the view function editor and views ecosystems, so it does get a little confusing. I do suggest using a value of 1, depending on what, or regardless of what mode you're working in when you're working with carbon scatter, just to keep the editor values for scale and the vectors correct. Setting values like 0.1, 0.5 can cause unpredictable results for the way the scale is set up. If you need to scale your scene because of that, you can go to the command manager and use the scale document command. So I just typed in scale in the filter, and you can see the scale document shows up. So you can use that to convert your scene to a new scale if needed. I'm going to go ahead and select the landscape object that I have in this scene, and I've just gone ahead and taken the carbon scatter pull down and added this to my objects menu and just on the side, and removed the text. So what you're going to see is the top icons, the paint ecosystem for the global ecosystem, populate object, the per object ecosystem, the carbon scatter options, clear ecosystem, and then the help menu. So I'm going to select just populate objects, and we're going to take a look at, really quickly, just the scale and how it differs for the plants. I'm going to go ahead and add in the alder from the tree menu. It really depends on which version you have for how many carbon scatter plants are available. Anytime you're using alphas to subtract leaves or create leaves, it's going to take longer to render. These types of plants are all based on that. So it's going to give us a message, and I'm going to say don't show that again, so that way it's not popping up all the time. The extended render times based on those alpha or transparency maps are not just restricted to the carbon scatter objects. That's something you're going to run into instancing, whether you're using MoGraph instances or carbon scatter instances, and whether or not the source geometry comes from the carbon scatter plants or Cinema 4D objects that you have. And it's just the rendering of transparency or alphas does take a lot longer. And that's something I've noticed while designing a lot of different plants and using MoGraph mostly for instancing. So if you are designing your own plants, try to make polygonal leaves and just stay away from alphas altogether, because it'll really improve the rendering speed, although it can increase the amount of memory needed. Okay, so taking a look at the scale, because the document, as I was showing before, is set to 1 meter, the scale for this plant, to be an accurate scale for the object, this would actually need to be set to 0.1. Now this is going to affect only the CS plants. Your objects, if you're using any native objects, they're not going to be affected. The scale of 1 is just going to keep them the correct scale. And I did close that out, so I'll just open that back up. So now I'm going to go ahead and just populate this, and we're going to see the plant showing up. Now this terrain, the landscape object I have is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, and then about 160 meters in height, approximately, just because the landscape itself doesn't reach that full length and that full scale that's set within the landscape amount. So this point up here, which is slightly above the top of the landscape, is 161 meters. So now if we were to work in a different document mode or different document scale, if we were working with 1 centimeter, then this scale would actually need to be 10 in order to be accurate. So the plants are scaled a little bit differently. And now I know the actual scales of what they're supposed to be just because I am a Vue user. And since everything came from Vue, I also have a list on the AZLFix website of most of the plant scales. This is the free page on the AZLFix website, and at the bottom you'll find a Vue vegetation reference chart. This is going to give you scale in meters of the different vegetation, and it should pretty much contain all the CS objects as well. So this is their intended size, and what would be basically realistic for the different trees and the different plants. So in order to get those scales correct, you really need to modify the initial scale. So just remembering, if the document scale is 1 meter, scale of all the CS plants will need to be set to 0.1. If you're working with document scale of, say, 1 centimeter, then they need to be set to 10. So you can just use that and calculate accordingly depending on your document scale. Going back and taking a look, if we look at the top of the material, and every material layer is going to have its own unique scale and mapping mode. Ecosystem populations are not affected by this scale. We could change this to, say, 100 populate, and it's not going to affect the scale of anything in the population list. That scale is used to control the function editor and the internal variables for controlling density, scale, and just about anything you can extract. So offset from surface, also direction from surface, rotation, anything you see these little drive with function buttons next to. So that's going to modify the function scale only. Also, if we choose to paint you can open the Carbon Scatter Painter and paint in instances, it's going to use the scale that is defined within the population list. And the scale that we see within the painter is basically the overall scaling, which is going to scale everything overall, just every single object in every instance. However, the global painter and the global ecosystem is set up a little differently, just depending on the way the instances are set up. So let's take a look at that just really quick. For now, I'm just going to clear this and choose Clear All Ecosystems. Basically, just remove the Carbon Scatter plugin from the scene and open up the painter. So now I'm going to add in a plant, and we'll just use the alder again. So now if I go to add these objects, you can see they're way too large. Clear it out. What we can do is go into the edit mode, and now this is for the global ecosystem. Change the scale, and now add them in. So I mean, in that sense, it works the same way, but you do have to go in and set these values first by selecting Edit, and then you can modify the scale after that. So this gives you a nice ability to be able to edit the population list either within the painter and then go in here to and change scale. Because otherwise you would have to change the scale slider down to 0.1 in order to really get everything scaled correctly, or 10 if you're working with centimeters, or some other system it might be different. The nice thing too is that you don't need to have use ecosystem population rules checked in order to modify scale of the instances within the list. That's really going to more control the other three tabs, which are the density, scaling, orientation, and the presence. And we'll take a look at the mapping modes and function scales separately and really go into the way it all works. But I just really quickly wanted to show how the instances or the native CS plants really need to be modified in order to get an accurate scale. Of course, you can change the scale to anything you like, but if you are working on something, document realistic scale, that is something that just needs to be changed.